Unit 12, Power or Knowledge. Contents: 12.1 Introduction, 12.2 Definition of Power, 12.3 Power, Knowledge and Discourse, 12.4 Foucault's Archeological Writings, 12.5 Foucault's Genealogical Writings, 12.6 Conclusion, 12.7 Further Reading. Learning Objectives. After you have read this unit, you should be able to define and discuss power, discuss the relationship of power and knowledge, outline what is Foucault's archaeology and genealogy. 12.1 Introduction. Sociologists usually define power as the ability to impose one's will on others, even if those others resist in some way. By power is meant that opportunity existing within a social relationship which permits one to carry out one's own will even against resistance and regardless of the basis on which this opportunity rests. Max Weber, Basic Concept of Sociology. Power manifests itself in a relational manner. That is, one cannot meaningfully say that a particular social actor has power without also specifying the other parties to the social relationships. Also, power almost always operates reciprocally, but usually not equally reciprocally. The understanding and analysis of power has been critical to sociological thought. One of the prominent delineations of power has been provided by Michael Foucault, 1926 to 1984. His works analyze the link between power and knowledge. Foucault began his intellectual pursuits in philosophy but became disillusioned by its abstractions and naive truth claims and turned to psychology and psychopathology. This resulted in his early writings Madness and Civilization, The Birth of Clinic, and initiated his lifelong interest in the relationship between power and knowledge. The main influence of Foucault's thought were German philosophers Friedrich Nietzsche and Martin Heidegger. Nietzsche contended that truth, knowledge and power are inextricably associated. He maintained that human behavior is motivated by a will to power and that traditional values had lost their power over society. Heidegger criticized that what he called our current technological understanding of being. Foucault's thought explored the shifting patterns of power within a society and the ways in which power relates to the self. He investigated the changing rules governing the kind of claims that could be taken seriously as true or false at different times in history. He also studied how everyday practices enabled people to define their identities and systematize knowledge. Events may be understood as being produced by nature, by human effort, or by God. Foucault argued that each way of understanding things had its advantage and its dangers. 12.2 Definition of Power. Foucault never attempts at any definition of power but gives a definition of power relations at best. The exercise of power is not simply a relationship between partners, individuals or collective. It is a way in which certain actions modify others, which is so say of course that something called power with or without a capital letter, which is assumed to exist universally in a concentrated or diffused form, does not exist. Foucault goes on to insist that knowledge and power are always necessarily interdependent. A site where power is enforced is also a site where knowledge is produced, and conversely, a site from which knowledge is derived is a place where power is exercised. In Discipline and Punish, he sees prison as an example of just such a site of power and as a place where knowledge essential to the modern social sciences was formed. Reciprocally, the ideas from which the social sciences were formulated were also the ones that gave birth to the prison. The belief that a scientist can arrive at an objective conclusion, Foucault argues, is one of the greatest fallacies of the modern humanist era. Modern humanism is therefore mistaken in drawing this line between knowledge and power. Knowledge and power are integrated with one another, and there is no point in dreaming of a time where knowledge will cease to depend on power. This is just a way of reviving humanism in a utopian guise. It is not possible for power to be exercised without knowledge. It is impossible for knowledge not to endanger power. So instead of referring to power and knowledge separately, he prefers to compound the term power knowledge. Box 12.1. The concept of discourse is central to many of the Foucault's ideas. He describes discourses as always identifying truth and knowledge at historically specific moments, but providing set of rules that define realities. This is especially prominent to scientific discourses which are legitimated by the rationality paradigm. Discourses containing power because they establish particular truth and knowledge, and their power is exercised through the creation and sustenance of social norms, practices, and institutions. In Foucauldian analysis, power is not monopolized by any one object through its control of predominant discourse. The discursive field comprises multiple objective subjects who manipulate various discourses to some extent. For Foucault, the issue is not origin of discourse, but the implication of their power, effect, and the types of knowledge they produce and institutionalize. Since power originates in discourses, it has no unitary source, but it heterogeneous and pluralistic, coming from everywhere and being everywhere. 12.3. Power, knowledge, and discourse. Foucault analyzes the relationship between power, knowledge, and discourse that develops from the establishment of enlightened rationality, which presents itself as progressive and emancipatory. The hegemony of enlightenment rationality and its institutions, and the marginalization of other discourses, creates and validate a social network of normative power which disciplines and constrains the individual at the micro level. Foucault studies that the emergence of several kinds of rationalities in history. The emergence of a particular kind of rationality then presupposes that the field of knowledge is tightly linked with an empirical field. Due to its instrumentality, a form of reason as well as any form of knowledge defines a sense of possible practices and is thus an instrument of power. Further, being embodied in an empirical field, a form of reason or any form of knowledge supported by it has no being beyond any set of practices. Therefore, the field of knowledge defines a field of power and vice versa. Power thus is not to be considered as oppositions to reason, but on the contrary as the necessary condition for the construction of knowledge. Moreover, because of the power produces knowledge, it can be at least partially grasped by archaeology. Reflection and action 12.1. What is the relationship between power and knowledge? Does one always imply the other? Discuss and write down your answer in a notebook. Foucault discussions of the nature of modern power is located within the postmodern framework. In keeping with the postmodern perspective, he critiques modernity and the universal claims of modern rationality and emphasizes multiplicity, discontinuity, and fragmentation. Foucault calls for a theoretical production which is independent, localized, and free from traditional discourse, such as his own application of the differing but overlapping perspective of psychology, medicine, criminology, and sexuality in his exploration of modernity. Two major approaches employed by Foucault in his analysis of power and knowledge were archaeology and genealogy. His aim is to establish genealogy of how power is exercised in our own society, basing his analysis on archaeology of the discursive formations. Hence, his analysis is aimed towards the modes of functioning of power in our society. 12.4. Foucault's archaeological writings. Foucault's early work provided an archaeology of knowledge, wherein he deconstructs the underlying unconscious rationalities of historically specific domains. In his first major work, Madness and Civilization, original French edition, then in English edition in 1965, Foucault traces the evolution of the relationship between insanity and modern reason. He examined the history and discursive process whereby insanity is constructed as the opposite of rationality and is systematically separated from the reasons through discourses of exclusions and institutions of confinement. Box 12.2. According to Foucault, the scientific psychiatry that emerged in the 19th century was invested with morality, and the scientific treatment of the insane was to occur through confinement. For Foucault, the power mechanism involved in the process were more repressive than the shackles of the past. Foucault's most elaborate archaeological exposition occurs in his following book, The Order of Things, in which he describes the emergence of the human and social sciences as a product of the underlying rules, assumptions, and ordering procedures of the Renaissance, classical, and modern eras, and the creation of man as a discursive construct of scientific knowledge and inquiry. In his final archaeological writing, The Archaeology of Knowledge, Foucault provides a reflective critique and clarification of his intellectual project, the development of a historical and theoretical epistemological space. Foucault's archaeological writing has been criticized for an excessive focus on discourse to the exclusion of social instruments and practice. Nevertheless, Foucault's archaeologists clearly privilege the analysis of theory and knowledge over social practices and institutions. An inquiry into the effect of discourse on social and political environment would require an evaluation of material institutions. This principle guided Foucault's next intellectual phase, in which he borrows from the Nietzschean principle of genealogy to concentrate explicitly on power effects and their relationship with knowledge. By Best and Kellen, 1991-45. 12.5. Foucault's genealogical writings. Genealogy signals a shift and broadening of Foucault's focus, but not a fundamental change in his vision. Like Foucault's archaeological writings, his genealogy explores discursive discontinuities and clarifies the historical context of positions which are presented as absolute. Following from archaeology, genealogy focuses on the multiplicities and pluralities within a field of discourse, explicates the shifting, discontinuous undercurrents of the evolutionary history, and examines the role of reasons in the production of human science. In contrast to genealogy aims at social, political, and economical institutions and practices, and the relationship between discursive and non-discursive domains. Following from this position, Foucault began to theorize about power in the 1970s from a non-totalizing, non-subjective, and non-humanistic perspective. His conception of power is radically different from the earlier juridical, political, and economic macro perspectives. He suggests that the power cannot be observed in these apparatuses, and that it is diffuse, non-specific, and polymorphous, shaping individual identities and bodies. Thus, unlike most earlier explanation, he does not see power as inhibiting and negative, but as a productive and perspective operating through the authority of social norms. Reflection and action. 12.2. Reflect on Foucault's genealogical approach. What are the advantages of such an approach? In his first genealogical work, Discipline and Punish, originally French edition 1975 and English edition 1971, Foucault describes the historical formation of the soul, body, and subject within disciplinary matrices of power, which operates in schools, armies, hospitals, factories, and prisons. He thus examines the relationship between the modern social institutions and the power relations of rationality. In his later work, Foucault explicates the nature of national power. Foucault critiques the repressive hypothesis by stating that the idea of sexual repression is a mechanism situated within the regime of power, knowledge, pleasure, which creates and sustains the discourse on sexuality and focus on the body as the site of control. Thus, Foucault reveals the ubiquitous and insidious operations of power, problematizes rationality, subjectivity, and knowledge, explores the links between power and knowledge. Foucault's vision has often been considered oppressive. His archaeological and genealogical works reveal the colonizing power of modern rationality and its dispersed presence throughout the social field. Nonetheless, Foucault's theorizing is grounded in the belief that knowledge can be transformative. At the same time, although discourses reinforce power, they also provide potential for resistance, whereby the Disenfranchised can extend oppositional discourses and demand legitimacy, frequently by appropriating institutional categories. Conclusion 12.6 Conclusion. Even if one does not agree with Foucault, at the very least, he reveals the pervasive presence of power in human existence and critiques the demonstrated validity of rationality, subjectivity, and knowledge. His analysis describes the extensive effect of power and its multiple operations in rational institutions such as school, hospital, factories, asylums, and prisons, in the production of scientific knowledge, and in the construction of epistemological systems. However, Foucault also have clear limitations. His critiques of modernity has been accused being one-sided, presenting only the negative results of rationality, which is limits its applicability. More significant is the startling neutrality of his analysis. Although Foucault states that power operates through knowledge and discourse, he ignores the reality that established the epistemologies favor certain group of individuals to the exclusion of others. The discourse of rationality itself has historically specific roots to right Western male intellectual. Thus, its predominance has very real and specific effects. Although he speaks of bringing subjective discourses into play, he does not address the fact that subjective discourses are discovered among clearly identifiable sections of the human population, among non-white, non-affluent, non-Western European, non-heterosexual men and women. In spite of practical goals of his analysis, Foucault has been broadly criticized his adversaries on the backdoor determinism inherent to his conception of power. However, Foucault has made an invaluable contribution to the study of power knowledge by opening new field of understanding and interpretation. 12.7 is for further reading. There is book like Birth of the Clinic, The Archeology of Knowledge, and Madness and Civilization. This is the end of the unit 12, also the end of block 3. Thank you very much.